So, welcome back to the Quantum Power channel, and today we have part 2 with Wolfgang Albrecht, the director and founder of the Besa Institute from Austria. And Wolfgang and I got to know each other actually only within the last, I would say, 12 to 13 months. And we got to know each other because we wanted to have our products tested by the Besa Institute. And then we sent our products, and it was a very exciting moment for me to see what is actually happening now. We knew what our products were doing, but of course we didn't know what the Besa results would be, which is really tested in detail. And yes, now it happened that we did further tests because the Besa method is extremely good. And the Besa Institute is excellently positioned to put our products through their paces. So now it happened that Wolfgang himself developed an interest in our products because they tested so positively. Maybe he can say something in between, but now I would like to give him a warm welcome and say thank you for the time. Thank you very, very much for the invitation, dear Philip. And yes, also from my side too. It is this humanity that I also feel in you, this warmth that is impressive, and that is decisive for me. That's why I think it works so well over a long distance. We have never met personally, only through Zoom. And yes, great, thank you. Super, so let's just start again. Maybe for those who haven't heard the first interview either. Maybe you can briefly explain again, in 2 or 3 minutes, what is Besa and basically how does it work? Besa, yes. Besa is a diagnostic machine, if you like, and stands for Bioenergy Informative System Analysis. For us, BIOS describes life per se, so explained very simply, and energy is informative. To keep it short, we are actually surrounded by information. And science says that only 2% come to our day-to-day consciousness. 89% basically only go into the subconsciousness. But this is exactly the information that determines our life. And that's why this energy means for us, how strongly this information affects our organism, how strongly is this information driven. And then we are informative. It is also important what information is of interest, because ultimately the information that reaches our body is responsible for our living conditions, for us and our health, and I would say even for our worldview, because we are triggered in a certain way in the subconsciousness, and here something is mirrored in our mind. And questioning that is Besa. And the bioenergy informative system analysis is again very simple. We, our organism as well as the world plan, function similarly to a cybernetic system. It is a closed loop. And this loop is interrupted somewhere. Then a blockade is initiated. And then a disturbance occurs in the control loop. And interestingly, our organism is so ingeniously structured that other control loops take over this, I'll say, the work. And there is an imbalance. In order to recognize this, means that we must or may understand the system in order to be able to intervene accordingly. That is called system analysis. We analyze the system following and look which control loops are there, which are currently in deregulation, and then try to question it. It all ends in a kind of energetic status, bioenergy for the informative status. That is what we then see in the evaluations. Although we keep that rather superficial in the evaluations. You could actually go much deeper, because every organ is connected to a joint, to a muscle. to an emotion. And we have that very, very deep inside. That's when we meet the great products that you initiate and develop here. Because ultimately, these are not only energetic, but they are this information, targeted according to the norm, I would say, to be corrected. This is the future. And I think, what does that mean? I think I am convinced of it. It won't be long, now that the time is running fast, all of medicine will change. It will go into that direction. And that is why we are so enthusiastic and with every word behind it. To be part of this development, to be able to understand these developments and to be able to better understand them, not only the devices, but also the functions of our body in connection with the cosmic. And yes, if we then go even deeper, it gives us the opportunity not only to go into the next dimensions, but also to understand where it is going for humanity. Excellent. Yes, thanks for the overview. I think this is very helpful. Everyone can once again understand how Besa thinks and what Besa tests. And before we maybe go into, maybe even in the direction of DNA and the functionality of these quantum energy products, maybe a quick turn on the subject of Zellspannung. In English, cellular voltage. And that is a subject that is getting more and more attention. That we even have something like that. Yes, on the one hand. And then there are differences. What are these differences? Why is cell voltage important? Where should it be? And what actually has an effect on the cell voltage? Because an essential part here is that you also measure the tension in the muscles and in the various organs. I'll start at the back now, Philip. So I would put it that way. We measure. We cannot measure the cell voltage. We test it. Yes. And that's a big difference for me. Because we don't have a test meter or measure the one that then expresses us a certain number. But we question ourselves, the field. So we go one step deeper and we query the field, so to speak, and get an answer for the electromagnetic field, so to speak. So that's I'll say, the transition from the electromagnetic field into the cosmic space, or into hyperspace, as it is called, or quantum space. And yes, so how does it work? This is exactly where we come into the subject of DNA later. It is also important to understand that the human being is electromagnetic here in this three-dimensional physical world. We are surrounded by the electromagnetic fields. Without that, there will be no life. And I talked about control loops before. So there are different control loops in the human, animal or vegetable organism, maybe different ones. Basically, you can say millions. To name a few important ones, to make it easier to understand. That is the cardiovascular system, the hormonal system, the lymphatic system, the nervous system, the system of the different salts that we have in our body, and. So these are all separate control loops that are controlled via the connection of the liver, kidneys, adrenal glands, exactly, and pituitary, epiphysis, thalamus. The third eye also plays an important role. The thyroid gland plays an important role as the feeler for our outside and controlling. It is controlled here. Why is it controllable? We are electromagnetic, and our thoughts control, so to speak, what defines us. So it is, of course it would. My heart beats, and that's what I start from. So now I would just live in fear that it would stop at any moment, or I go even deeper into fear and even depression. Then I get a problem with my heart, because it will start to deviate from the norm. Yes, well, and that is our spirit's way with every organ, which has a massive influence on the electromagnetic situation and ultimately from the expression that an organ, in further consequence, then brings with it. So always according to the norm, which then goes back to the values that you mentioned. A musculature has a different cellular voltage, if you like, than the heart. The heart also has a higher cellular voltage, but the bones, which vibrate more deeply, also have a lower voltage potential. And so, it is structured differently. Because it is electromagnetic, yes, but everything is connected. It vibrates. It is subject to a certain vibration. That is the common denominator, and that is crucial. And over there is the control. It is our mind in the connection with the thyroid or the thyroid control. And yes, that means that if we look closely, it is the smallest unit, the cell. Around the cell is the so-called cell membrane. And what is decisive is what information then gets into the cell. And so, that is information of, let's say, let's step back a little. There is an extracellular environment and an intracellular environment. So the extracellular milieu is also referred to as the so-called bath water in which the cell swims. Yes, it is a milieu, the cell is inside. And then there is the intracellular, which is, so to speak, protected by the membrane. That's kind of the essence. And there is another cell nucleus. And in the cell nucleus is this DNA, or this DNA has its own nucleus again. In other words, the information contained in this vitamin C is brought into the interior of the cell via the cell membrane, and that requires the right cell voltage. It takes the right polarization. That means inside the cell we have a negative polarization and positive outside the cell. And this creates an induction field, which is, if you say, also a pump, which then pumps certain information inside. If this polarization were to change, certain substances could no longer enter the cell. And then it is said that you can no longer take in oxygen. And that would mean the cell changes its essence. So it will become a completely different being. For example, an anaerobe, which is no longer able to take in oxygen. She works anaerobically. It also learned from evolution to live without oxygen, and thus it excludes itself from the other areas of the cell. And so it is out of the norm. One speaks of a sick cell, or inflammation can change this voltage potential on the cell membrane. And that's easy too. There are these oscilloscopes where you can, so to speak, record this cell voltage. There you can see the sine wave, because wherever there is an electric potential, a magnetic field builds up. And we tend to work with this magnetic field. We check and look at the magnetic field. With Besa, we found a way to tell what the device is showing. If the device reads 50, we have an ideal cell polarization. That means our cell voltage and the magnetic field is working properly. It communicates properly with the cosmic field, which is where you come into play. And in the event of a blockage, then there are also restrictions in this magnetic field. It is no longer 100% able to transport oxygen according to the norm. And oxygen is just what we need. This is all crucial, together with water. Oxygen and water have a high affinity for a bond, and everything that combines in the course of the water and oxygen is taken up into the cell over the membrane. Then it goes on. In the cell, you then have mitochondria, which have different combustion chambers. And so it goes deep down into the essence of this DNA. So, yes. So I just tried to explain it in a simple way. Yes, I find it exciting. It is not a new concept for me, or how it works, but I think it's an excellent example for many who are watching right now. I have a question about vitamins on this topic, which probably interests many now. So, if I now have a vitamin C and vitamin D frequency and feed them in as a frequency. The information arrives. Now, when it comes to vitamin C and vitamin D, we are talking about different levels. We say now, okay, for example, there are studies in the currently much discussed disease that say that there was not a single case of this disease above a certain vitamin D level in the blood until now. So nothing registered. In any case, no one had been in the hospital, no one died from this disease with a correspondingly high vitamin D level. So what's the difference now? If I now have the information, I take vitamin D on one side, and now I have a vitamin D pill here. And alternatively, I can take 4 a day, and now I take 4, so that this level is correspondingly high. How does this information change, so to speak? And how is that different from the simple frequency of vitamin D? Because I'm here now, I can take 1 or 4, and here I always have the frequency. Do you have any ideas about this? We plan to... I didn't understand some things now because the internet was briefly interrupted. I think it's important to differentiate. We've talked about energy in an informative way. How strong is the force with which information works? Yes. In the physical. I'll tell you, if you have the DNA card, or it is the case here that you receive information all the time. So that means for me it is crucial if I get this information constantly or over certain hours. Then the intensity is not so important. However, if I only say I take vitamins physically, regardless of whether transdermal or I just accept them as drops, I have the problem here, again, too much could cause you not to take it up again. If the intestine is unable to absorb them, then you are creating oxidative structures again. On the other hand, if you take too little, it may be that due to certain stress factors, it doesn't even begin to get anywhere. Often, 1 drop is enough. The information would only have to go immediately when I have my consciousness prepared for it, then I don't need any more. Yes. And that means the amount. So, if I take a drop of vitamin D with my prepared consciousness, then I would actually have the same effect as 20 drops, without this spiritual impulse to do so. So it's our experience. We've already tested it out. And the difficulty is that people just throw it in and not think about what's going to happen now. The lack of awareness of the process that is initiated in the body. Yes, I cannot assume that everyone knows what vitamin D does and how it works. Perhaps I would like to explain it like this. If we only go there with the awareness that vitamin D helps me to achieve the norm of creation, everything is actually already together. We have already integrated everything that we need. Creation is so great that we don't need to know how it works. A certain amount of awareness and gratitude is enough. That creates a picture, right? A picture. Yes, absolutely. I know this topic from myself, because I used to think the more the better. It is always better to give too much than too little. It's bullshit. I was allowed to learn that from my wife, Eva. This is also the case with seasoning. A little too much curcuma may help, but the food no longer tastes good. That's great, yes. While we are still on the subject, I found that really exciting. It was really easy for the audience to break down this topic of vitamins. Cellular information. What is happening there? How is it now in general with the pure quantum energy with which we work? There it is. it is relatively easy for us to test what does the quantum block or the infinity block do now, for example. What are the results? I'll go in there. Can I see them under the dark field microscope? What does my blood look like? How does the nervous system, heart rate, variability change? There are different measuring methods where we still have difficulty with and are repeatedly asked about it. Yes, man, how? But how does it actually work now? And interestingly, there are a lot of things. So let's take the chaga mushroom. Yes, CHAGA, which is the most studied medical mushroom on Earth. Now, many studies, unbelievable numbers of studies, what he does and what he can do. Even then, you can't explain why he's doing it. But you can try. And I know that you have already spoken a lot about it and describe hyperspace. And if you could perhaps try to describe it for the audience in your own words. Yes, how does the infinity block actually work? Knowing that you can't do it 100% up until now, because I don't think anyone can. That would be great. Okay. You mentioned something, and I don't know if it was a question. I'll go back to that very briefly. To understand that there is a blockage in the body, for example. And now comes energy with a certain force, with a certain thrust. So not energy, information arrives at this blockage with a certain force. And this information would be able to resolve this blockage. And now it is so that if I am not able to go into this blockage with my mind at the same time, to perceive it, then it's difficult because this information has to build up a certain autonomy in the subconsciousness. And now it can be, case 1, I increase the energy with more thrust. If I push the information to this blockage, then it can break through it. Or the increased energy that lies behind this information arrives, and here the blockage builds up a counter-energy, and the symptom will intensify. And then come these statements, yeah, that doesn't help, I get even more pain. It could be that you have to stick with it, because at some point this blockage will disperse, or it may not overturn. Then I may also understand, okay, take away energy. Information can stay, reduce energy, and see what could be. How can I still move mentally to this blockage in order to recognize it? I just wanted to say that very briefly. And thus, a more thrust for the information can also yield better results. Doesn't always have to, but in a great many cases it does. Yes. And yes, we have here on this earth, to explain briefly how it is, how this can work. How do we bring quantum energy here in the physical world? We live here in 3 dimensions, for example, in physical space or 4-dimensional, actually. And everything, I say, outside of these 4 dimensions, or especially 7, 9, 12 dimensions high, this is what we call this so-called quantum space. There are different rooms. It works differently. The space is subtle and doesn't need electrical fields. It doesn't work electromagnetically, because it's not physical. These electromagnetic fields only exist in the physical. Physical also means I can measure my strength. I can measure a distance. How fast I ride with a bike from A to B is a distance. How much strength do I need to cope with this path in time? You can measure these things. That means that everything that can be measured in the 3-dimensional space or in the physical space Outside of the space, there is no time either. Outside of the fourth dimension, there is neither space nor time. I can't measure anything. It is like it is. This is going to go too deep now, but we're out there. In other words, we have two rooms here, and we need a common denominator, so that we can combine them. And here there are these so-called interaction channels. That's what we call them. This is the connection between hyperspace, between the subtle fields. This is ultimately also matter. If you look closely, it is so-called nigentropic. But a common denominator is found via so-called interaction channels. In order to be able to use this highly potent energy in our physical space. And how does it work? How exactly does your infinity block work now, for example? Here comes. This is where DNA actually comes into play. Because, let's go back, the cell with its nucleus, in which the DNA is located, is a very important tool. If you enlarge it very, very much, you can see that nothing actually has a plasma structure. The more one goes into the physical, the more one recognizes the crystal as something crystalline. And if you take it exactly, our whole body is made up of crystals. We started with the crystal structure of salt, sugar, molecules, even the crystal structure of hexagonal water. That is, when we go from the physical, we come to the water. At some point we come to information, and this DNA is very, very important, because you represent a mirror, an important mirror, namely of this quantum world, of this matrix in front of the hyperspace, in which ours is located. I say, our soul is our original as such, our higher self. We have the opportunity to mirror what we physically need here via this DNA in our body, to mirror it into our consciousness. And it is crucial that this mirror of DNA, this crystal, that is clear, that a mirror can also arise. Because every deformation of this plasma structure, or if this crystal becomes cloudy, then information can no longer be mirrored 100% of the original information here into the physical, and then distortions occur. This means this information about ourselves is so distorted by the DNA that only certain information arrives here. And that means it deviates through this changed DNA. These norms deviate and the distortions form, which then ultimately lead to distorted worldviews, distorted living conditions up to illness. And we have the opportunity with the infinity block. This one. Do we call it either an interaction channel, or do we go deep into the DNA? We have the opportunity to restore this mirror image, often to polish it, to change it as we want, because this is where a strong energy associated with this field is involved, can communicate with the cosmic field, with the matrix, with the quantum field. And I have the opportunity to get much more power through the support than if I do it mentally. So we have lost, we have forgotten over millennia that we have the ability to mirror the original from our higher self and to renew ourselves accordingly. And this infinity block and its power play an important role. The trust behind the information now plays an important role. Here something is reflected again, and I learn that I not only function better, and I also learn to change my consciousness again. The more the DNA can reflect, the more my right brain develops, and I get stronger intuition, stronger feelings in the direction of love, gratitude, humility. And that's exactly what's missing, and that's self-healing for DNA, if we will. We are re-establishing the connection to our higher selves. It is Yes, you can explain it with the most varied of words or possibilities, representations. I am often as fascinated as others about the goal or explaining it. How should I put it? Our many measurements with Besa simply give us the feeling or create the image inside me. It has to be like that, or it has to move on this level. And yes, this is how these arise. Just as you said it correctly, it is always difficult to explain exactly. A common denominator is needed. I am convinced that this common denominator is love, gratitude, humility, the joy of living. Excellent. So I am very grateful that you have just accepted that, this challenge to talk about it. Because it is not easy to put this topic into words, because words in themselves are so limited, and it's easier experienced that can be described. And I think you got so excited how you explained that. It also coincides with what I have always say, it is actually in essence what the quantum block and the infinity block do to the energy. It invites us into our own completeness, and it also supports us in this way. This is of course now simply how energetically and technically described what it does. And that's exactly what you actually broke down into the actual process, although I hadn't mentioned it at all. And I think many are really grateful now, those who have looked for it, and those who needed it for understanding. And I would also say now that we can maybe even close it here, because there is hardly anything left to add. I would still like to have you back in the near future, because it is so exciting to talk about this energetic and physical topic with someone who can really describe it from so many different angles. And I think everyone who listens to has, because he gets great impulses from it, a much better understanding and awareness. And I think anyone who has heard this now can work even harder on self-healing by taking up these impulses that you have given. I am very grateful. Thank you very, very, very much. Thanks. That's what I say, dear Philip. And you said it so nicely too. Use words to describe the feeling you feel about your wife. I always say, every word that I use cannot reflect what I want to describe with love. So, and also in the area of language, we were so manipulated. And yes, we are allowed to learn so much, because it is also crucial. Yes, how we speak and interact with one another. Yes, you're absolutely right. Absolutely wonderful, Wolfgang. Then many thanks to you, everyone who watched. Thanks to Wolfgang for your time, and see you very soon. Thank you, dear Philip. Thank you for inviting me too.